Senator Boxer was going to be sending somebody here today. Is she here? Okay, Megan Miller, thank you so much for coming for Senator Boxer. And also Assembly Jared Huffman from Marin Sonoma County, State Assembly Huffman. His assistant Jenny Calloway, is she here? Jenny, hello. This is wonderful. I'm very glad you're here to hear this program today. I'd like to introduce our last speaker. Lloyd Morgan was the lead author of the Cellphones and Brain Tumors 15 Reasons for Concern report. He's the Senior Science Fellow for the Environmental Health Trust, a member of the Bioelectromagnetics Society. Lloyd is a retired electronics engineer with 38 years of industrial experience. He's also a brain tumor survivor. He's co-authored epidemiological papers. He's also the author of a paper estimating the risk of brain tumors from cell phone use, published case control studies, published in Pathophysiology in August 2009.
What does the science tell us? Well, before we go there, what does industry tell us? The weight of the evidence says there is no problem. This is not true. Industry studies and the weight of the evidence says there is a problem. There's no known mechanism, implying the data must be wrong. Probable mechanisms exist, but requiring a mechanism is anti-science in itself. First comes the data, then decades to centuries later, mechanisms are understood. There's no known mechanism for smoking and lung cancer. With so many cell phones in use, if they were causing brain tumors, then we should see an increase in brain tumors. And there is no such increase. It's true. There is no increase in the incidence of brain tumors yet. But the average latency time for brain tumors is 30+ years. The question to ask is, what % of all people were using cell phones 30+ years ago? So tumor risks from cell phone use. We have brain cancer, acoustic neuroma, which is a tumor on the acoustic nerve, meningioma you just heard about, it's the lining of our brains, the meninges. Salivary gland tumor, particular one is a parotid gland tumor. Uveal melanoma is an eye cancer. Testicular cancer. But there were survivors. And there's been a study group for many years since. And they found many increases of cancer, but it took a long time. There was no increase in brain tumors until 40 years later. What does the science study for human studies? So there are 6 early studies. 5 of them are industry funded. They were too early to expect a risk. Typical use was less than 3 years. Why would they do that? Because you can't find a risk. There are Swedish studies you've already heard about without industry funding. They're headed by the Hardell team. They looked at cell phones and cordless phones. Cordless phones are really also cell phones. And then there's the Interphone study, which you've heard a lot about. It had substantial industry funding, 13 different countries, but not the United States. Defined a user as somebody who used a cell phone for once a week for at least 6 months. Now, would you find lung cancer if you smoked 1 cigarette a week for 6 months? They only looked at cell phone use, but they asked every subject if they use a cordless phone. And more subjects use cordless phones than cell phones. So what did they do with that result? They treated the cordless phone as a non-exposure. So they have a systematic underestimation of risk. You've seen that already. Here's the Hardell studies for children. If you start using a cell phone, and that's the important thing, when do you start? As a teenager or younger, you can see dramatic increases in brain cancer. This is more than 1 year of use. At the same time, you can see the numbers for adults. Children are far more at risk from all carcinogens than we adults are. They looked at high-grade brain cancer. I mean, brain cancer is pretty nasty. High-grade brain cancer is even far worse. What did we find? For every 100 hours of use, your risk increases by 4%. And for every year of use, your risk of high-grade brain cancer increases by 11%. Every year. They looked at use on the same side of the head. And you can see for cell phones and cordless phones, 130% or 100% increased risk of brain cancer. They look for greater than 10 years of use and greater than 2,000 hours of use. And you can see we have large increases in both cases, virtually identical for 2,000 hours or greater than 10 years of use. The Interphone study's underestimation of risk, we've already heard about. In their own paper, they said, well, it's at least 19% underestimation, but somewhere between 6 to 30% at 95% confidence. However, they also added the protective effect could result from the sources of error discussed above, although the magnitude and effects may not account fully for the observed reduction. So even as they're saying this is their underestimation, this still doesn't account fully. We published at a conference in Korea last year called Reevaluation Interphone Study Application of Correction Factor, and showed that there's a 25% underestimation of risk with a range between 11 and 47% underestimation. So what does the Interphone study found? Well, they did the pooled results from all 13 countries. They found no overall risk when the median use was 2 to 2.5 hours a month and 100 cumulative hours of use. Now, you that are cell phone users, just think about how many hours a month you use a cell phone. But with longer-term use, the Interphone study found 118% increased risk for greater than 10 years of use, compared to very short users, that is 1 to 1.9 years. The systematic underestimation of risk, the most common finding they find for less than 10 years is using a cell phone provides statistically significant protection from a brain tumor. And they had 32 separate results showing this in the study. So let's compare Hardell versus Interphone studies. What this doesn't show, but you basically have a much larger, I'm not sure why it didn't show up, much higher risk from the Hardell studies, much lower. You can sort of see it by the placement of these images. I don't know if that industry funding had anything to do with the difference. We also have other tumors, 290% increased risk of acoustic neuroma, and it's an Interphone study for greater than 10 years of use. 380% risk of meningioma for greater than 1,600 cumulative hours of use within 1 to 4 years of cell phone use beginning. Again, an Interphone study. Now appreciate, all of these risks are larger than that. An 81% risk of parotid gland tumors, the salivary gland tumor. Again, this is the Israeli study, more than 1,035 cumulative hours of use. Salivary gland tumors have tripled in Israel, and Israel is the single heaviest cell phone user in the world. 20% of the salivary gland tumors are under the age of 20. Here's a picture of our salivary glands, and you can see the parotid gland is the big gland in your cheek, which is where the cell phone is. Risk of other tumors. 320% increased risk of uveal melanoma, an eye cancer. Probable to certain exposure to mobile phones, said the study, which was by Stang et al. In Germany in 2001. 80% increased risk of testicular cancer. If you put it in the left pocket, it's your left testicle. If you prefer, you can put it in the right pocket and get it on their right testicle. In other words, this is that same, on the same side where you use a cell phone is where you find the tumor. The risk to male fertility. The Cleveland Clinic, among many others, have shown serious problems. Sperm count degradation and surviving sperm itself is degraded. So animal studies and cellular studies. We've already heard that Henry Lai found double-strand breaks after a 2-hour exposure in DNA and blood-brain barrier leakage in rat brains after 2 hours in another study. They also found as a result of the blood-brain barrier leakage there was dead neurons in the rat brains. And before they sacrifice in the vocabulary of the science, the rats. They also put them through cognitive studies. They had been trained how to find food and were very quick and easy to find it, but after having cell phones, they had a hard time finding the food. We have human cellular studies that were in many, many European countries. This is that famous European reflex study. It's an acronym. Multiple replications. It wasn't just one lab. It was everywhere. GSM is the second generation phones, the ones before smartphones, and genotoxicity is telling us that essentially the genes are damaged. When you look at the UMTS modulation technique, which is the smartphone technique, you find it's 10 times larger at the same power levels. I'm going to skip past some of the reflex studies, but let's just say that there's a dose-response relationship. There's a risk per hour of use. You can see here there's almost no risk for the first 4 hours, and then by the time you get to 16 to 18 hours, it's dramatic. What does industry tell us? All agencies says there is no problem. The World Health Organization, Food and Drug Administration, Federal Communications Commission, and of course the National Cancer Institute. Regulators are controlled by the corporations they regulate. Any of us that are American citizens already know this. The World Health Organization has an EMF project within it, and guess who funds it? The industry. And they're the ones that report this. The FDA, it requires pre-market safety testing of all electrical devices held to the body, but they granted an exclusive waiver to the cell phone industry that they didn't have to do that. And the waiver champion within the FDA right afterwards went to work for Motorola. They approved Vioxx, when they had data ahead of time showing that it caused an increased risk of heart attacks. There was an enormous amount of heart attacks. Merck, the manufacturer, pulled it from the market, but the FDA had never acted, even after there was weeks and weeks of reporting of all these heart attacks. Who's in charge, regulators or industry? The FCC. Exposure limit based on false industry premise that the only biological effect from cell phone radiation is heating. It only protects against cooking the brain, and it's guaranteed it will not cook your brain. The industry designed a cell phone certification process that substantially underestimates the cell phone risk for children by 2.5-fold. And the NCI did a study that the researchers refused, that were protested that it shouldn't be done because it's too early, but they went ahead and did it. So with human studies, animal studies, cellular studies, all showing serious health effects, what more is required before our public health agencies act? Thank you.